we affectionately call coaches. Today marks the beginning of this semester's talks, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the Student Learning Outcome Coordinators training for this semester. Joining me, we have a couple of fellow coaches here, Enrique, Jarek, and Liza. Will assist me in moderating, and I'll let them introduce themselves. Jarek.
Yes, good morning. I'm the founder of the Friday SLO Talks. I work as faculty coordinator from school at School of Continuing Education at Santa Ana College. So welcome, everyone.
Good morning. Happy Friday. Yeah, so my name is Lisa Rubinovich, and I'm an adjunct instructor of English and ESL at several community colleges in San Diego. So nice to see you all. And Enrique, want to go?
Good morning, everyone. I apologize, my voice is somewhat down today. My name is Enrique Jauregui. I'm the SLO coordinator for Fresno City College. We are located in the Central Valley, sister to Amanda Tainter's Reedy Community College. So thank you and welcome, everyone.
All right, and Benny's here. I don't know if he wants to speak, but he's there. All right.
All right, Enrique.
Thank you, everyone. So with that being said, during our Friday SLO Talks, we highly encourage active participation. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to use the chat feature or simply raise your hand. We will ensure you get a chance to speak or as soon as there's a pause in the discussion. So please feel free to use the chat feature. All materials and recordings from the SLO Talks will be accessible on the coach's blog. Should you have any questions for us, please don't hesitate to reach out to the info@coaches.institute, and I'll put the link as soon as possible. And so once again, welcome.
And so today we're honored to introduce Dr. Natasha Jankowski as one of our featured speakers for today's Friday SLO Talk. Dr. Jankowski is a distinguished figure in the realm of higher education and assessment. Her extensive background includes her role as the former executive director of the National Institute of Learning Outcomes Assessment. Currently, she contributes her expertise to the faculty of New England College. Dr. Jankowski's career also boasts significant positions such as the Senior Fellow for Community Colleges with the Strata Education Foundation, and her tenure as a Research Associate Professor and Graduate Program Coordinator at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. I hope I said that right. She is an accomplished author of various assessment-related publications and is renowned for her presentations on the assessment of student learning process and practices, both nationally and internationally. Welcome and thank you for being here. We are also thrilled to welcome Dr. Joseph D. Levy as a speaker at our Friday SLO Talk. Dr. Levy holds the position of Associate Vice Provost of Accreditation and Quality Improvement at Excelsior University. His educational journey began with a BA in English from Baldwin Wallace College, followed by an MS in Student Affairs and Higher Education from Colorado State University, and culminating with an EDD in Higher Education Leadership from National Louis University. Dr. Levy is a prominent member of the Student Affairs Assessment Leaders Board of Directors and has significantly contributed to the field as a co-creator and instructor for the Applying and Leading Assessment in Student Affairs open course. Additionally, he is an endorsed speaker for the National Institute of Learning Outcomes Assessment. Known as an author, presenter, trainer, and consultant, Dr. Levy utilizes his extensive experience across academic and student affairs from various institutions to engage in meaningful discussions about assessment, quality assurance, and the enhancement of institutional practices. Welcome, Dr. Levy. Thank you for being here.
And I'm going to butt in real quick. I just want Benny to give a chance to say hello. I missed him. And he is one of our coaches that's going to be helping to moderate. So Benny, if you just want to do a quick wave, and then we'll hand it back over to Natasha and Joe.
Thank you, Amanda. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are. My name is Benny Ng. I'm the student college outcomes coordinator at Los Angeles PS College, and nice to see you all.
Well, thank you so much. We are delighted to be with you and spend this time together. Let me go ahead and share some slides. And yes, these slides will be shared with you, but I'm not going to give you the link yet because there's some animation that I want to have happen. And I don't want you to get ahead of me. So we will share the slides and I'll share them about partway through so that you have that link as well. But for now, we'll go to slideshow. And we'll start here. So thank you, thank you. We're delighted to be joining you on the sort of the first portion of your training today, and then we'll get out of your way and let you get back into the rest of your kind of conversations around coordinators. But what we're going to do this first part is really give you a roller coaster ride speed through a bit of theory, some practice, and resources with some time to answer questions. And I know that Joe is having some interesting technology journeys today. So I'll start introducing myself a bit more. Thank you for the wonderfully lovely introduction, but I think two key points to know about how I will be approaching some of the things we're talking about today is I think assessment is better when done with a bit of humor. And my humor is very, very dad joke oriented. So apologies in advance for that, but there will be try to be some fun and intermixed. My background is also not in measurement, but in philosophy. And so that is something that I tried to bring through the assessment conversation is why are we doing what we're doing? What's behind the things that we're getting into? What are the implications and assumptions that we build our work upon before we jump into the doing of the work and in that space? And a lot of the things that I pull from are focused in equity, the involvement of students, and also the work that I did at the National Institute for Learning Outcomes Assessment. If you're not familiar with NALOA, it is an online repository for research nationally on what is going on with assessment of student learning, and then what are things that you can do to think about that in relation to your work. And Joe, I don't know if you'd like to say a little bit more about yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Natasha. Hi, everybody. Well, here we are. I've been on Zoom all day and things were working fine and just all of a sudden isn't working for this meeting. But hello, my name is Joe Levy, and as shared, I work at Excelsior University overseeing all things assessment and student learning, as well as accreditation. And with my background, I was an English major and a math minor with my undergrad, so kind of working both sides of the brain, and have just been always a bit of a Renaissance man in terms of things that I get involved in. I play bass guitar. I like going to concerts. I also like to do competitive eating challenges. But aside from that, love assessment. It's one thing that just connects for me. And one of the things I really appreciated about higher education is furthering my own knowledge and resources and my personal and professional development. And so I, want to make sure that we deliver on those promises that we're making for students and have data to help inform us on what we're doing well as well as areas to improve. So excited to be here and chat with you all as we look to go.
Thank you so much. And thank you for navigating your Zoom. And yeah, when I first found out you're a competitive eater, I was like, is it stress eating from like the assessment work? And like, how does this play out? So it is I definitely recommend having concert conversations and competitive eating conversations with Joe, in addition to assessment related ones. But what I want to do first is give us a bit of a brief history on how we became divided in some of our structures and how this impacts what we're trying to do today in assessment and sort of how these things fit together or don't in terms of why we do assessment, how we go about doing it, some of the barriers that we run into in trying to change our assessment practice or shift in different and new directions. And so this is not comprehensive. This is very high level. We don't get into nuance or in the weeds, but I want to give you sort of, some sprinkling along the ways of sort of some basics in our history that have impacted our approaches, our philosophies, and our theories, and our processes and practices that we do within our institution. So buckle up. This is condensed. The first part to think about is that first and foremost, faculty and student affairs staff have a long history in assessment. We talk about assessment as something that started in the 80s, but way before that time, you had faculty and student affairs that were engaged in rubric conversations, in portfolios about student works, in gathering information and data and used to enhance and improve their educational offerings, in a deep-seated love of program evaluation and connected literatures there. So things have been happening sort of on the ground in our practice day to day of how do we go about what we're doing? How can we answer questions that we have about our practice, and how do we get better? In the 80s, you have this shorter tail history that comes in of external accountability. And these are more of these external accountability drivers that show up saying, I want to see what you're doing, and I want you to prove to me you're of value, that you're being accountable to the standards or goals and things that you set. These are where you have the accreditors are coming. We have to get our things in order. You have a state reports that we're requesting information around sort of what is it that students are learning, deep into that, I would say, generalized comparability structure in some guys. And that drove the creation of a lot of the first initial systems of reporting, assessing student learning that we were kind of dealing with in ricochets and getting from today. That was done at an institution level. We want to know that as a whole institution, institutions are being accountable, doing these kinds of things, and engaging in that stated goals of meeting it. But what that did is it led often to a two-tiered system of student learning outcomes assessment, where you had things that we were doing as an institution to report out for external accountability. So that's sort of your level one. These were places like where we did a standardized test that didn't mean anything to us in courses or didn't change anything about our programmatic offerings. We didn't know what to do with the data because it was about reporting out, or things like national surveys to compare ourselves to other institutions. But it was like, well, what does that mean for our practice? Harder to connect the two. So you had this external accountability sort of structure of things that were happening at an institution level. All the while, internal improvement efforts were happening on the ground in programs with student affairs and classrooms with faculty. And it was intended for quite a while that these two would not connect, that it was, we will protect the internal improvement pieces and we'll report out these external institution parts. We don't want people looking at what's going on over here. We want to keep that safe. This is where you hear faculty be like, I didn't know that this is what I'm doing is also assessment. I didn't know that's what you wanted to know about, because for a long time, we kept that very separate and apart from these two structures and systems. More recently, though, in like the last 10 years, I'd say, we're moving to try to bridge that gap or make connections between it. So we don't have things we're doing just for external purposes, but things we're doing that are mattering internal, to say, how can we take what's going on the ground that are the things that we use most often, that are the most meaningful and beneficial to us as practitioners, and report that out in our accountability papers, mandates, whatever that might be. So if you see a lot of movement towards mapping, how do I map how I connect to something higher up? Alignment exercises. How can I say that this is an instance of getting to an institution learning outcome or a program learning outcome or a professional licensure standard that is then embedded through the things that we're doing in our classes, in our program offerings, and collecting sort of artifacts at that level and getting into conversations on assignment design. The point here of all of that kind of quick run through of a very brief condensed history is that assessment changes and flows and ebbs and moves over time. There's not one way to do it that you lock in and then you're good to go in these things. There are movements of pieces where we've done certain things at particular points and times when we've switched it and done something else. There are many ways to go about doing assessment work, and those many ways shift over time. So before you get into any kind of assessment conversation or you want to change anything about your assessment process, it's very important to look at what's your institutional history of engaging with assessment. How did it go? How's it been? What was tried in the past but wasn't? What sort of echoes still remain from those experiences along the way? And then think about why are you engaging in assessment? What are you doing it for today? Why does it matter? What are you trying? What's the purpose behind doing this work? And how do you want to build structures that really reinforce that purpose? I will also say within the scholarship of assessment, while there's a lot of how-to information on the practice side, there's a lot of debates on how we should go about doing this work. And so if you are looking to like, just tell me what I need to do with assessment, you can do what you want in some regards, but there are some guidance and inputs around that. But you shouldn't feel bound. by the practice, but you do need to understand your history. You do need to understand the culture of where you're coming into to make that change, but know that you do have flexibility in that space. So if we think about, why we are doing assessment today and sort of what's going on in that space and the recommendations around that area, one, you can start with like, well, what's our purpose for doing assessment? And the purpose for doing assessment is directly connected to the approaches that we do to go about assessing student learning, as well as the processes that we build, whether that's reporting structures, whether that's the type of data that we collect. All of these things are related to and connected to each other. So if you're saying like, well, our purpose for engaging and assessing student learning is for external accountability, like we have reports we need to do, we have accreditation that's coming next year, let's get this together and get this handled. I have things that I need to give to a system office. I have state requirements that need to be met. I have professional licensure that requires certain documentation along this way. So that's kind of fine. The engagement of the purpose of external accountability often finds it falls into two approaches to go about doing the work of assessment, and that is compliance and measurement. So if you're like, this is our reason, how are we going to do it? What's our approach to engaging in it? Compliance is more like, what do I have to do to pass? What do I need to have in place? What are the structures that need to be there? How much of what do you need to see that leads to these rules that are like, I need one indirect and one direct. I need 3 of these and 1 of that. I need it to be 2 pages long. I need this on a reporting form. And people are like, why are you asking me this information? And you're like, because I need it for compliance. Measurement, and the other way to think about it is like, okay, if I'm doing external, I need to be able to compare. So I need things that I can generalize. I need things that look across the sample. I want to be able to say how we're doing in relation to our peers might be part of that. And so the measurement conversation really guides then what you get into as the processes that you put in place. So on the process side of things, if we're thinking like compliance, this is where you're like, whatever your data collection reporting cycle might be, annual, biannual, whatever the cycle for these things are, and what dictates on that form, what you put on a template, what you do in it, could be, if it's about external accountability, is going to be the bare minimum that we need, or what's the bar we need to pass to meet our compliance to do what we're doing in that space. Oftentimes there's a lot of bureaucracy related to this. It's reviewing it in relation to compliance. This is where you have the like, we have a ton of data, but I don't know what anyone does with it. Or I fill out a lot of reports, but I don't know where I went. Well, where it went was to meet compliance to give to external accountability. On the measurement side of things, this is where you have a lot of that assessment tool isn't going to count. Only these types of assessment tools will count. They have to be a value add measure. They need to be something that's standardized. This is where you see assessment programs that say, everyone needs to give the same type of assignment in a class. So we're getting something that we could see across that's the same. And I want to be able to look at it longitudinally over time or potentially in some of those areas. So the point to this is to say what our purpose is guides how we go about engaging with this work and the processes that we build to change it. If you have processes in place that don't line up with the purpose that you want to do for assessment, you're going to have conversations to start to shift and move the purpose. The other part of, alternately, I will say, if in the external accountability conversation is the purpose of assessment is that internal improvement. So if you remember sort of our 2 tiers that I mentioned, the internal improvement one goes and the debate continues. If you're not familiar with Peter Yule's work on this and interested, there's a link to that in the slide of like the improvements and accountability debates and how do we navigate those, because we ideally want a little bit of both in those spaces. But if our purpose for engaging in assessment is internal improvement, then this kind of falls into sort of 2 buckets. There's more buckets. It's easier to put 2 on each slide. So we'll keep it this way for purposes of slide presentation. One is teaching and learning. So this is more, I want to do internal improvement because I want to improve our teaching and our learning, whether that's our learning environment, whether that's the type of program offerings that are going on or the educational experiences that students have within that, or the educational dialogue that engages in between faculty and staff, or my program. What are we doing as a program? Who are we? What are we trying to create? How do each of our parts connect and add together to be a coherent educational experience for our student? These are 2 kind of ways to think about and get into it. Under each of those, again, you have the processes. How do we go about doing that work? How are we going about engaging in it? And one is, well, I have questions that drive my practice. Like, If I'm changing something in my course, is it helping my students? Is it helping all of my students? Is it helping some of my students? Which ones? If I'm changing a reading, if I change an assignment, if I'm changing a mode of presentation, how are these things impacting it? It also has a heavy focus at times on assignment design and student affairs. This could also be artifacts, work samples, and student employment. It's another area that this plays out. And in program evaluation, you see a lot more of things around how do our different parts fit together, right? So are students getting that coherent experience, building a lot oftentimes from the program evaluation literature and side of things, but are we working well together? Is this coherent for our students? Do they understand and experience it? Is our program achieving what we're trying to do? And how do we all sort of fit together in ways that get us there in a meaningful, efficient, and effective manner? These will have very, very different assessment looking processes, practices, types of data, and things. And they're not wrong, they're not right. They're just different ways that we can go about engaging and approaching in our work. But I will say that one big piece that is lost in this split, in this dichotomous history of accountability and improvement, is the concept of relational accountability. To whom are we connected? What are the relationships? How are we accountable to each other? And how are we accountable to our students? A lot of the first sort of history and our focus and assessment for years was upon being an improved institution, being a better program for future students, not thinking about what's happening for our students in real time here. And also how can we do better by our current students? What do we owe our students? What is that connection of relationships to that? This is something that also comes from Indigenous research methodologies and a history in there. So if you're interested in that, it's a great place to go and look towards it. But under relational accountability, this is really where the focus upon the student as the main purpose and approach and getting into assessment lives. So if you're like, yeah, I get we got to do it for accountability. And yeah, we should be improving. But who's the one that improves? It's our students. Who's the one that's doing the learning? It's our students. The relational accountability piece is where you can really think about students being involved as partners in this work, students as the co-creators of their learning, sits and gets into that. If you're interested in thinking about student involvement in assessment, I put some resources in the slide, which, I can now share with you our slide deck because I got through my first part. There you go. So please feel free to take a look. They're in the notes section, any of the links that you want for things. And happy to add other links as questions come up in between Joe and I. But this is also where a lot of the work on equity in assessment, in culturally responsive assessment occurs, is in thinking about what is our relationship to learning, what is our students' relationship to learning, what is our relationship to each other, and how do these pieces play out. All of these different purposes of assessment also connect in different ways. There's these nice Venn diagrams that the National Understanding of Assessment Framework presents on sort of how different pieces fit, because they aren't separate. There are places of overlap in ways that they connect. Is in a distinction. Yeah, don't look to Joe. Be surprised for Joe on his slides. Is the distinction of assessment of, as, or for, and what that means. So while this is often more, I will say the assessment of, as, or for is more a faculty-centric model and approach that's been presented, it is equally applicable to student affairs assessment. But in the assessment of, assessment is really like the objective measurement of learning. So if you think about our external accountability piece, it's can we prove that our students know based on specific measures? A lot of times this takes the form of a high stakes exam at the end, and we're like, okay, I'm assessing that they did learning, so it's an assessment of their learning. Did you get it? Did you not? This is also places where you see GPA used and other kind of indicators of learning is the assessment of piece. Assessment as learning is that, well, students actually are going through and engaging in this learning process. They're thinking about how does this happen? What is my own process of engaging in this? It's more about how they learn about their own learning process. So through the act of being assessed, learning happens. I'm engaging in this assessment. The assessment is actually helping me learn in that space. And so you want to see, how did I know more about myself, my learning, and my self-regulation in that learning environment as a student by going through assessment. You can see in some ways how these align up or don't with internal or external accountability pieces or relational accountability. And assessment for learning is really the conversations that we have every day back and forth with our students on the process of learning. In a lot of this came random side note for anyone that's interested and wants to nerd out on this, in the United Kingdom, there's a lot of feedback work and feed forward. And so that dialogic back and forth in assessment for learning is heavily rooted in the timely feedback and feed forward. But it is, how do we go about assessing to have students say, here's where you are, but how do we move you in your learning? So I want to see this, but it's not to say, ha, you got it or you didn't, or, oh, let's learn more about how you learn, but to say, where are you in that trajectory, and how can we think about finding ways to advance you? What would that look like? What do you understand? Where are we in this, and how do we move together? I say all of these kinds of things because depending on why one is engaged in assessment and the structures that are built and the processes and practices that you have in play, some of the things that we're facing today in assessment matter in particular ways, or they don't matter in particular ways because of what you're trying to do with assessment, how it's structured, how it's built, and all of that. So if you're like, great, that was a nice history lesson and purpose and lovely, and Joe will take you down into like practical pieces later. What does this mean in relation to sort of our AI and assessment, if we're concerned about generative AI, if we're not concerned about generative AI, and how does this play out in relation to our assessment? I'll give you a high level take on it. One is that much like assessment has been around for a very long time, generative AI has been around and used by higher education for many, many years. The difference is that it's much more readily available to students. The user interface is easy, and it can start doing tasks in ways that are beneficial for some, depending on what you're offloading, or could be very difficult for our academic integrity. So one of our parts of assessment is, I want to know that if I took an assessment, this was me, that it was, I'm the one that did it. And if I didn't do it, is it an assessment of my learning, or is it an assessment of how I can navigate to put materials together? And, you know, if that was the assignment, then you're getting it good. But if that wasn't the assignment, then there's a problem. So there's concerns in academic integrity on students using it. There's been a lot of work of faculty trying to revise assignments in ways to make them more authentic, make them more meaningful for students, to think about the role of writing or see the process of writing. There's concerns about how do we catch students' use of it, which the answer is it's very hard, if not impossible, to do so. But academic integrity is only a concern in certain ways of thinking about what you're trying to do in assessment. In others, you hear conversations that are like, well, we need learning outcomes related to AI. We need to build this into our curriculum to say we need to teach students how to use AI responsibly. They're going to be using it in employment. So what do we need to add to either our program or our course or our activity experiential learning outcomes related to meaningful use of AI that's ethically responsible, but also ensures that we aren't creating equity gaps between our students that can use this technology and other students that can't. Still, there's another group that's like, you know what, we could use this in our work as assessors. Like, if we're going to go meet with a program and they're like, I don't know, I need some help brainstorming learning outcomes, we can put in a prompt and be like, I would like some learning outcomes around this, or here are some course descriptions, here are some syllabi, what are the learning outcomes that you see connected across this that could be used to start a conversation. There are some assessment programs that are building chatbots to help faculty who are going through completing the reports, annual reports, that have sort of the main questions that are being asked about those. You can use them to create rubrics, templates for things, data visualization, presentation. There are certain things that AI is good at and not so great at, so careful there. But there's a lot of opportunity too to saying, how are we using this in our work, and how can we make this more meaningful? Layered throughout our conversations on equitable access. If you have to pay for a model to get the great things, what does that mean? Is that a problem? Bias is built into a lot of these models. There's a huge potential for harm depending on what you're using them for, doing with it. So all of that we need to be careful and think about. And on the institution side and policy side of things, it's a bit all over the place on guidance around use. Some have individual faculty that have conflicting statements around what they can and can't do with AI, and others, institutions, line up. So it's a opportunity space for points and discussions and dialogues. But again, depending on why you're doing assessment, what your background with it is, what you're trying to accomplish, and how you're going about the process of doing it, certain parts of these things will be more readily important to you than others. And if you're wondering, how do I navigate all of this landscape? How do I help my faculty and my institution and my student affairs staff make choices? I strongly encourage considering the framework that was developed by Coughlin, Miller, and Patterson. It was for online proctoring as to like decisions around why is it applicable or not. But it outlines, it's applicable in a variety of technology spaces. So what are the values and principles at play that we need to consider and navigate when making choices related to AI, guidance on that space, and all of that? Academic integrity is one of many. So you have things like fairness, transparency, privacy, respect for autonomy, liberty and trust, like all of these pieces that oftentimes in assessment, we pick 2 or 3 and ignore the rest. And so it's a helpful way for us as we think about what do we want to do in this space, where do we comfortable, where do we want to go to engage in. Now, I'll say you have had plenty at this point of my philosophical theoretical opening. So I will pause, and I bet you're ready for a bit more of like the practical side of things. So I will pause before I pass this to Joe and say, are there any questions, comments, things that I can address on this part? And then Joe will take us into, well, what does this mean for our practice and day-to-day work?
I had a quick question. I don't see anybody else's hands. This might be too deep for right now, but how do we change the narrative to focus not so much on accountability, like assessment being an accountability driven conversation versus a faculty led conversation?
Mm-hmm. Well, some of that is we have a history that we have to navigate with it, and it's sort of 2 parts. One, we need to train our administrators to not show up and start talking about assessment in advance of accountability reports, because it can really set back what we've been working on in like teaching, learning, and conversations. They're like, oh, great, but we're doing this really for these parts. So we need to train up on the administrators and make sure that we're getting that support in framing what's the narrative that we want to talk about, why we're doing this work. And then we need to have clear narrative components around, we did this work at one point in time for these things. However, we have found our own inherent value for doing this. This matters for us because of these things. Here are these faculty that have done this work that make the case for why at our institution and what we're trying to do, this has value in and of itself for where we want to go as an institution. And so if we can do that, moving it from whatever external piece needed us, that was our general impetus to engage in it, because most often in US institutions, it was an external factor that got us to build the vast majority of our systems, to then talk about how we want to claim and take ownership of this in ways that are meaningful and responsible for us. That this is meaningful for our institution, and here are people of our institution that have done that. But if we don't get the administrators to echo that mission, language, and narrative, it becomes a lot harder for us to move it internally.
Thank you. I'm just sitting there and reflecting on like, oh, that's exactly what's happening at my institution. So thank you for that. I took notes. But I had another question. So, there's this long-standing notion that teachers should not merely be the quote sages on the stage, end quote, and that has evolved further with the ubiquity of AI in education. So how can faculty members reconsider their approaches to teaching and learning in this context? Are there any specific guidelines or practices recommended for integrating AI effectively into educational strategies?
I think so sort of 2 things that I would say to start with is, 1, figure out where your faculty are and where their comfort zone is. There's a wide range of where people are like, I've heard of it, but I haven't dabbled in it, to I've played with it some, but I haven't really figured out how this can be beneficial, to I use it to take notes in my class that I then synthesize and give to my students about what we talked about that day. And I've created a chat bot for our students from it to help them with the readings, and are really embedding it in a lot of their work. So there's a wide spectrum. So I think first is get a handle on, within your institution, what's that breadth, and where do you have faculty leaders that are excelling that can lead a learning community around this conversation, particularly around pedagogy, because there are some that are leading in ways of like their research and their scholarship, and citation softwares and those kinds of things, but there are some that are leading in the pedagogy piece. And so can you create a learning community where you're like, I see you doing great work, you're asking good questions, but you're also running out really far, and how can we sort of get other people into conversation on it, I think is one. But I would say we cannot do this without our students. We don't want this to be another space where we are doing things to our students or on our students' behalf without co-creating or considering it with them, and how they are thinking about where this fits or where it doesn't. And so the more too that we can say, here's what we're doing in our own space as professionals and faculty to see how this can integrate with our pedagogy. Can I use this to also make more meaningful handouts or a study guide for my students or sample test questions or whatever that might be, that I can create tools and resources to help my students in this regard. But how are my students using it? Is it helpful to my students to create things like this? What do they need and where are they in their feeling and process is sort of the two-part triangle that we need to build a good foundation of it actually advancing meaningful pedagogy and learning, I think, anyway. All right. I will be back with if you have more questions. So for now, I want to be mindful of our time. I'm going to pass it to Joe. And Joe, since you're having weird technology things, I will be your slide advancer. If you want, I'm happy to do so. I see you. Do you want to do slides?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, before the slide, I just wanted to address the note that so could you all not hear me talking before?
No.
Okay. Well, we're back. I did a full reboot and now I'm officially back. Hi, everybody. Okay, so just to build off of what you shared, Natasha, I think the other important thing, and this delves into my side of it, is you first have to acknowledge that first part of what you said, right? So before we get to the AI, we have to reconcile the fact that we still very well might have faculty who still see themselves as a sage on the stage. And we have to remind them that that is not the best way to communicate and teach people. So you first have to address that, because if that's their mentality and their understanding of role and responsibility, and then you're handing them some AI tools or trying to have that conversation, there could be a huge disconnect because they don't even see that they might be needing to do the things to work better with their students, co-create learning in the environment. They may still see that they are the only imparters of wisdom and knowledge, and students have no role but to sit and listen. So you certainly have to deal with that component too, and then get into the resources and AI piece. But that being said, I want to move into my side. So this first one gets into a bit of what Natasha was alluding to, is I want to bring us back from the future to the current state and talk about, and this gets to Amanda's question as well, of how do we best set the tone around assessment? And I think it's this way. I always say and try and say that assessment should be these things. It should be meaningful, right? It should matter to the people that are involved in the work. If it doesn't, you need to stop there. Because if we're talking about student learning, for whether it's an academic program or a student affairs area, they should value what those learning outcomes are. Their curriculum and their interventions should be aligned to that. Therefore, they should care about then the evidence of it. So if from the beginning, if you're talking learning outcomes and the faculty or the staff say, yeah, I don't really align with these, or I don't know who said them, it's like, well, we need to stop there, because if you don't connect to it, then once we get the data, you're still probably going to shrug your shoulders at it. So it needs to be meaningful. And then the next piece, it needs to be impactful. This should lead to change. Assessment should be helping us better understand things and make the learning environment better for our students. So if it's not, we need to examine that, right? What barriers did we encounter? What stopped us from taking action? But all this work needs to be manageable. And this is where AI can help, right? To make things more manageable. But we need to make sure that we're not taking on too much. There's no assessment literature that says you have to measure everything all the time. And we know that learning is messy and complex. So to try and task somebody with measuring any and all of their learning outcomes all the time is just an unsustainable task, right? So how can we approach assessment in a way that is realistic, also to your interventions, right? And manageable for us to get our arms around, especially when we know that to measure a learning outcome, we should probably be doing it in multiple ways. And so if you're measuring one outcome in multiple ways, and then you have multiple outcomes, that's a lot of stuff to track and manage and can easily get unwieldy. So we need to work to make it manageable. But because we need assessment to be informative, right? It should both answer questions as well as generate inquiry, both about student learning, but also about our processes, our pedagogy, our teaching and learning practices, which leads to the last point of assessment should be robust. One of the reasons why I love doing assessment work is it has so many beneficial byproducts and has so many connections to teaching and learning, faculty, classroom instruction, student affairs interventions. Assessment can help inform those. Assessment can also help inform strategic planning conversations, budgeting, resource allocation. It can be evidence to help inform those things. So I like these concepts because I think it's a good checklist, especially if you're thinking about your culture or even individual office or program practice. Are you going to achieve these things? If not, go back to the drawing board, relook at your learning outcomes, and also make sure folks are kind of bringing the right attitude to this work. So the next slide is, I wouldn't be a good student affairs rep if I didn't talk about this. I worked with Presence to make this side by side to show that student affairs or co-curricular assessment is not fundamentally different from academic affairs assessment, right? They have most of the same components: interventions, purposeful content, and integrated measures. The big difference is that co-curricular and student affairs is just at a huge disadvantage because academic affairs, students need to go to courses, right? They have to pass their courses to graduate. Therefore, they need to take the integrated measures. They need to take the tests, turn in their papers. They need to do the things that academic affairs is looking for them to do to have the data on student learning. Typically with student affairs and co-curricular, students aren't required to engage with those areas, offices, and interventions. And if they are, it's maybe a one-time thing. They're certainly not as regularly substantively interacting as they might be with a faculty member in a classroom or across the interventions in an academic program. So I always tell people, like, student affairs actually has it a lot harder because their captive audience is much harder to tap into, and there's less compelling reason for the students to engage and provide data than there is on the academic side. But I also like this image because it shows that there is common language here. There is common ground. And when we're talking about student learning and talking about student success, we need to be thinking about it holistically. Because a student, as they're thinking about college and how it's going to help them gain necessary skills to succeed, they don't really care where they're getting that from. Right? They appreciate when they're getting it from the classroom to get the factual knowledge, but they also appreciate going to career services to get the resume and job interview prep. Because again, that's all part of their same goals as they're moving forward. So we need to be treating these equally and making sure we're bringing these populations together when we're talking about assessment of student learning, what we're learning about it, how we can improve it. The next slide gets into an acrostic I made, again, English major, that can be helpful as we think through methods and the work that we're actually doing. I like this because as an assessment person, I'm sure you all can relate. There are many times people will come up to you and just automatically start with, I need a survey, or I need a rubric, and you're like, whoa, like, what are your learning outcomes? Or how does this fit with your larger process? And what are you trying to answer? And so I made this acrostic because it not only helps slow things down and make sure you're going about it in an intentional way, but it also gives you a step-by-step process to follow in terms of building a specific method or using a method. So first, you're considering your purpose. So what are our learning outcomes? What are you trying to measure? We're reviewing our past efforts. And a little bit of a Jedi mind trick here is, if you've never had past data efforts here, what if you did? What's the data you wish you would have had kind of coming into this conversation? So thinking about that to help inform maybe the data you might be collecting now. And regardless of what your method is, evaluating it for appropriateness. I think in an ideal world, everyone would love to be able to sit down and talk to students to get the answer, to talk to every single student, right? To get answers they may need to questions. And that would be great, but it's not feasible. We don't have the time. The students don't have the time. So how do we go from that ideal state to then what's going to be appropriate with the actual intervention at hand, as well as the resources and logistics, which gets into the next point as we then think about also timing, not only our own timing and preferences, but thinking about the students, right? We need to be real careful collecting data around finals week. And, if students are on break, not a good time to launch a survey. So what do we need to think about around those things, as well as the institutional environment, right? Are there political components we need to think about in terms of this data we're collecting, that we're going to need to be sensitive about how we ask this question or how we present these data? And so we need to think about it on the front end to help remove those barriers or best set ourselves up for success later. And as we develop whatever this method is or select it, test it, please, before you launch it. There's nothing sadder than when it's the end of the year and I'm pulling data for faculty and I go to them and I say, like, oh yeah, like, I know we worked really hard to build those rubrics, but your faculty didn't fill them out. Or I know we worked really hard on designing this data collection survey, but people filled it out wrong. Or I don't think it collected the data you hoped it would. So we can mitigate those things by trying to test it on the front end to see what the data looks like, as well as see if there's any questions or barriers. And a great thing to do here is to involve students and have them tap into and give you feedback on what questions they have and what clarities may be needed. And then the last piece is ensure your purpose is satisfied. So again, thinking back of, given all this work and what we're doing, what we're collecting, are we still meeting our purpose? And if you go through this, you should have a really solid instrument or method for your approach. The next slide is important to think about when I talk about reporting, and when you think about reporting, it should be this. It's not just a spreadsheet, and it's also not a book. We should be succinctly talking about our process, the analysis, the interpretation, and what we're going to do about it. So what we do, what we find, what does it mean, and what are we going to do? And that message packaged in a report may need to look different for different audiences. I guarantee your supervisor would want to see this information to a certain extent and in a certain tone and detail. But what if you were to talk about this with students? I guarantee you wouldn't give them the same type of report. You would approach it differently. But you would still cover these components to a certain extent. So how are we thinking about reporting to our respective audiences who should hear and know this information? And to that end, this next slide just really underscores the fact that we need to be telling stories with the data. Data don't speak for themselves. We're the ones that give them meaning. So we need to make sure we're not making assumptions of, oh, if I share this with somebody, they'll get it. They'll see what the problems are, or they'll know where the areas of, like, we need to do that, and we need to contextualize it too. This next slide is something I talk about often in terms of, as we're collecting all this data, we need to do something with it, right? I call this data negligence. Of, if you have reports just sitting on a shelf, you're almost better off if you didn't do it, because at least if you didn't do it, you could claim ignorance, right? Of, oh, well, we don't know, right? Whereas if you know something's bad or something could be improved and you just put it on the shelf and don't take action, I mean, that's not good. So this is your sign, right? This is all the reasons why you need to make sure you're taking action. And so that's this next slide. I love this image of just promoting, this is what you got to do. We have to make sure we're taking action with the results. We have to use it to inform our decisions, to inform our future plans. If nothing else, every assessment effort should always have the evergreen action point of sharing to multiple audiences. We do that far too little with students, and I imagine we probably do it far too little to other relevant audiences and communities of interest. So we need to make time for that. And if you get to the end and realize, well, I can't take action, or I don't know how to do that, maybe you set the wrong outcomes, or maybe you weren't answering or collecting data on actionable things, which, think about that and have it, consider that for the future as well. Benny, what's up?
Yes, thank you, Joe. Sorry, a quick question. Given this student learning assessment oftentimes heavily influenced by the administrative requirement or the faculty teaching method. How can we communicate to students that their learning is very important, not just the grade? I think oftentimes I'm think students just don't talk about the grade and not enough about that learning.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot of ways we can do that, even going beyond faculty. Of we can better talk to students about learning outcomes and contextualize it in relation to their goals, their major, their professional ambitions, even from an orientation perspective of if this is the job you're working in or you want to work in, and this is the degree you're picking, like, let's look from the learning outcomes are going to be the skills and knowledge you are hopefully going to gain in this experience. And so helping break down not just these are your degree requirements, but these are the learning outcomes we're hoping you get. And then even in every individual class, faculty can utilize going over the syllabus to be very intentional of not just, okay, we'll skip past the course learning outcomes and get into here's your assignments and the due dates and your readings. But no, this is how this all fits together. And this is how this class builds upon this other class or will prepare you for this next class. And not just the class itself, but these concepts, right? First, we're teaching you about what a business plan is. Then we're teaching you about how to evaluate a business plan. Then we're teaching you about how to comparatively evaluate those things. And that may happen across multiple courses, or that evaluative component may happen in different contexts. And we need to do a better job helping students understand where all that is happening so they can also have better language to talk about, especially transferable skills that they're gaining throughout the collegiate environment, both inside and outside of the classroom.
Joe, I think you said it better, man. At the end of the day, right? It's ensuring that learning is taking place. Make sure that the students have the skills, excuse me, and the competencies, to carry those over, either if you're transferring or receiving a degree. So at the end of the day, that's what that is. I think you nailed it. Guillermo, you have a comment?
Not a comment, really. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Not a comment, really. It's just a question. And I come from a business background. I think business is the largest major in our college. The students that I see, their main concern is getting a job. And one thing that I believe that we could do is help them get an internship. At the institutional level, I think unless we kind of call out that, we'll never measure it. But that's definitely a path for the students to earn a living wage once they leave the college. So I'm wondering how to have that conversation.
I'll add two thoughts to this. I love that question and I love this conversation. And Joe, sorry to jump in, but I think some of it is saying, the course is one place that we're providing learning experiences and opportunities, but we also want to make sure that you're prepared to apply this in a variety of settings. And so if it is actually about that learning, then going, where are we giving multiple opportunities for students to apply? And that realize what I've learned in this course, I can apply over here, and not just in another course, but in this work setting, or if I'm currently working where I can do that. And so internships really help us and our students see, I know why you were asking me to learn that. I see that applicability of it. I'm making those connections, and I'm not having that aha moment when I get out into my job. I'm coming in, I can come into my interview and say, I know I can do this, this, and this in these different settings. This is what I need to be successful. And I know that not because I took a course on it, but because I've done these things. And so I think setting it up as yes, we have this, but we also want to know in a variety of learning experiences that we can apply and transfer that knowledge to different contexts can really help elevate up internship conversations. But it's also really important to figure out, where are your faculty with these kinds of things? Like, if I think about assessment as a gatekeeper, so if I see in my profession, not everyone can come in, let's say, and be an accountant, then I will see assessment as a filtering mechanism connected to grades and not about this is why I'm teaching you this, because it's going to build in another class on these ways. I'm going to try to say, you know, do you have what it takes to fit into the disciplines that we're going? And in that case, having a conversation on it's about learning and not grades, and assessment is like connected to pedagogy will be very difficult, because the conversation with faculty is one of, but not everyone can come through. We have to filter. So understanding too, what's the culture of a program or department? What are the view that faculty bring about who gets to learn, how many we can have, what that is, and what the role of assessment is, can really aid in those conversations on, you know, how is this beneficial to us and our students, and what other kinds of opportunities do we need to engage in? And if we do that, what kind of data do we need from it? Do we want employer voice and student voice? Do we want faculty? Like, all of those other pieces can come from those conversations.
Thank you.
And I see, Joe, that you responded to Dinel's Vez. I know I just butchered your name, and I apologize for that. But I know if you wanted to speak about that answer or the question, I'm going to say I'll speak it out loud, because I also love what you said earlier, Joe, of looking at assessment holistically across the campus. And I know for our campus, it's something that I've been really trying to push the conversation to our administrative services, our student support services, to understand that assessment is not just something that is instructional, but we all need to look at it. And then I don't know if that ties really well to someone else had said in the chat about we're asking to be assessing or teaching these soft skills, and maybe that's where the college other parts of that aren't instructional can come alongside. So let me read the question, and then Joe, if you had anything else to add besides what you put in the chat. Can you speak to assessment processes for administrative units on campus? Any interesting resources on designing meaningful process for these areas would be appreciated.
Yeah, so certainly if we're talking student affairs or co-curricular areas, I would recommend the Student Affairs Assessment Leaders as a great resource, and they have webinars, blogs, a journal, podcasts, an open course with all sorts of resources to better understand and execute on that work. But I see the clarification around it's more truly administrative, like HR, registrar, and with those, I say it's a very similar process to assessment. Maybe, and this is where there can be an overlap with evaluation, because some of those offices don't necessarily have student learning outcomes. Some of them do. Like financial aid is one of my favorite examples to use of learning outcomes existing and reminding those folks they're educators, because where else are you going to learn about responsible borrowing, right? And that's an intervention that they're talking with students about for loans. And to a certain extent, registrar, depending on your institution and what it might look like from an academic advising or course selection process, there may be some learning outcomes there. But if there is no student interactions and it's truly operational and just dealing with like staff and faculty or personnel, it's, again, you can follow kind of the general assessment process of articulating what your goals are or what the things are that you do that you want to measure, identifying some measurements, measuring, and looking to take action. I often use even our assessment templates as a good example or starting point for them. Just there's and often instead of it being a student learning outcome, it may be a faculty and staff learning outcome, especially with internal policies or things that they're trying to inform people on. And yeah, the soft skill piece, I would come back to what is learning. I always say learning is action, skills, behaviors, knowledge, right? So soft skills are learning outcomes. If our institutions aren't accounting for those, we need to, especially if they're employer job market relevant, and or important to a certain discipline or the institution from an institutional learning outcome or general education perspective. That's where we need to evolve and integrate those things, depending on what they could be.
I will also add that there are some good resources on the soft skill things. NACE is a good outlet for that. The National Association of College and Employers. I'm like too many acronyms. I'm like, I don't remember what it is, but they have career readiness pieces. But part of it is not adding more to what you're doing, but how you go about having someone demonstrate one of your learning outcomes can use soft skills to get there. So if you already say as a program, we have a programmatic learning outcome that's incredibly disciplinary specific or professionally driven, and I want you to talk about it, but you're going to use effective communication in a group to do it. the means by which I'm asking students to present it can also reinforce and help with those soft skills. Sometimes though we get in, we have to add to, and so now I have 10 learning outcomes and I have to check each of these things instead of thinking about how are these aligned, where are we already doing this work that I just need to elevate up and say, have I prepared students to work effectively in teams? If I did, what would that look like and entail? And getting into some of these spaces. But I think the soft skills conversation is one that will only get more prominent as we look at the value conversations around higher education. And so thinking in advance of how do we embed this or elevate up and draw attention to where we are doing that for our students is a good use of time. I would pause it.
I want to try and get through these next couple slides quickly because I know Natasha and I have a stop here coming up, but this just making the point and a bit, this goes back to the culture element of really working to regularly, daily infuse assessment considerations, right? Because if we're doing it right, it should have relevant information around learning outcomes, either things that we're planning to measure, how they're aligned to things, how we can better talk about it with students, as we were talking about before, as well as where current data collection efforts are, how we can plan to use that data. There's all sorts of ways to make it relevant and talk about it. And likewise, the next slide then also shows the fact that assessment can really be used in other contexts, and it can be used to amplify efforts. I love using assessment evidence to help justify budget requests or strategic initiatives. So that's that point. And then I just had a couple slides that you all can review since we sent to you, but just some considerations of, establishing your expectations around learning in general and even learning for specific areas, exploring your barriers and owning that, right? Let's not shy away from the fact that we can have barriers to our process. And then the last two slides I had were just some questions around things to then talk to your students about, because we should be talking to our students. We shouldn't just take faculty and staff word on what students need and interpret and how they're experiencing things. Let's actually talk to the students and see how well that information lines up.
Oh, yes. So if you want to know more about these things, I'm sorry. I was like getting in the chat and I forgot I was running slides. This is what happens when I start. Like, I'm like, I'm a part of this whole thing. Also, if you're interested in this and you're like, oh, I'd like to hear more, I want a deeper dive in things, Joe and I are actually working on an assessment textbook that starts with the first half being actually more of a history, theory, philosophy piece, and then the latter half being the practical. What does this mean and how does that sort of get into the options that are presented to us in our practice and that kind of thing? So if you're interested and you're like, who's going to help us with that? We will. We're happy to. Some of the things that we'll cover in that are in sort of the foundation piece, the models and organization of how these are structured. We didn't even really talk about that today. Reporting lines, if it's a committee, how many people are in your office, if you have an office, if the student affairs is part of that or not, and how sort of all those things play out. And then moving it more into theory to practice in talking about setting it up from writing learning outcomes all the way to using this information or having conversations and advancing it. The last part that we want to do in that text is really also think about where do we go as a field and how do we really create pipelines of leaders for this? And so what are the competencies to be successful in an assessment professional? There's some work that's been happening around that, but something that I really love to elevate out. Who else do you partner with in this space? We cannot do it alone. Assessment, we're like knocking on doors like, hello, and people are like closing, flip the sign to like, oh, closed for business. So how do you partner? With whom should you partner? How does that work? And then how do you get past a compliance mindset? We talked about some of that today. But if that's sort of what we've been embedded in and what our history is known, how do we move to really get to where we want assessment to be what we want it to do for our students and our learners and for our institutions? We also threw some resources in if you need things, and if you're interested in any conversations on AI, there's a Java Jams group that meets and does it, and you can join the group. You can also present if you're doing something fun for that. But yes, if you have anything else, please let us know and reach out to us. Joe, anything I missed in that?
No, you covered it well.
All right. I will end my share screen so I can see you all. Any questions that you have? Or
We did have a question in the Q&A section, it's particularly tricky to work towards assessment for learning when faculty are concerned about grade inflation and academic integrity. What do you recommend for getting across to this kind of resistance?
I have two different thoughts on this, at least two. But I think one of them very quickly would be if we're getting better at educating, which we should be over time, and if we are refining our practice to improve, where if you come here as a student, you're learning the things that we intend to learn and we're getting better as teachers, our grades should improve if our grades are actually about learning. So if our grades include things like, did you meet our learning outcomes and how do these things relate and all of those parts, it would actually be very sad if we weren't getting better in that direction. And so we've had grade inflation has been an issue for years. It's something that consistently comes up in related to faculty. But what is the role and purpose of grades? What are we trying to do with grades? What does it mean? And again, if I'm a faculty member thinking this is a filtration mechanism, then grade inflation is a problem if more people are getting A's. If I also am thinking about, well, how have I changed a grading structure and what goes into that? If I've gotten clear on how I grade in relation to a rubric, and that's now more transparent to my students, we know they're able to actually meet and attain that learning in more beneficial ways. So is it, I'm a better teacher and my students are actually better able to demonstrate that learning and engage in it? Or is it oftentimes the debate is, oh, it's too easy and too many people are getting A's, and that's a problem for what we're going into. So part of that conversation is what's the role of grades? What is the purpose of that? How does it relate to assessment? Before you even know kind of how to navigate into that space and if it's related to learning or not. I had a second point, but that was too long of an answer.
Well, I might pick up on maybe what your second point too is so on the academic integrity front, it's still part of that larger conversation, because one might, I've been at institutions and talked with faculty where they say, well, I don't think it's fair that for assessment purposes, you're kind of locking down certain assignments or requiring that I use a certain rubric. To which I would say, like, if you want to do something different, talk that over among yourselves. It will make trying to assess and have evidence of learning and making sure students have equivalent learning outcomes a lot harder if we don't have consistent measures. But if you all trust your people and you're going to dig in and do some sort of alignment or crosswalk to see how assignment A for one instructor correlates to assignment B, and that we know that those students walking away from those different course sections from different faculty with different assignments still have the knowledge, skills, and competencies that we expect them to have, knock yourselves out, right? I mean, it's just like I've had faculty complain that assessment can be too quantitative and that they're qualitative research. I said, no one says it can't be qualitative, but any qualitative research will tell you it's a lot more time consuming to do that. But if you want to do all qualitative assessment, I support it. Good luck. So I don't say that to say that assessment, we should go the path of least resistance or be easy, but it goes back to that bigger conversation of assessment is supposed to be evidencing the learning we're expecting students to have. And if we are giving the freedom of our faculty to get students from point A to point B, however they individually see fit, then that challenge of measuring that learning journey for effectiveness and the end student competency gets a lot trickier if we don't have common measures. But it's not impossible. So it comes back again to a conversation, because that's where I won't tell a faculty member no. I'll just tell them this is how it's going to get interesting as we go through the reporting process, which we need to do. And that's where, again, connecting it to what Natasha said, you're working with faculty around, well, you believe this is important, right? You believe making sure students have learned what they should in this class is important, right? Okay, well, we have to measure that somehow, whether that's grades, whether that's specific observations, whether it's certain parts of a rubric to get at certain elements of a learning outcome.
Mhm.
We got to do it somehow. We have a lot of freedom and creativity to do it, but what's going to be best for your discipline and your people and your resources and your time, and what's going to be most meaningful for you? And that's where, you really just need to have those real, authentic conversations with folks, because I think it's really easy to, at face value, push back on like academic integrity or this, that. And it's like, okay, well, how do we square that then in relation to these real needs and real questions that we have to answer? and work through that. And it can look different. And you know, that's where I would say give the flexibility, but you still need the end product. And that's where I've had faculty, again, like the qualitative example, that's where faculty quickly sat down. I told them, do all your assessment in a qualitative way. And they're like, well, we actually like the rubrics and we like the grading. It's like, okay, well, I mean, you all the ones that said that was your thing. And so I think sometimes this pushback, people glob on to certain issues or topics that really isn't the issue at heart. And so for me, I'm always trying to understand, well, what's the real problem? What's the real issue? Is it that you don't feel empowered? That you don't feel like you have enough voice to talk about student learning, or you're worried it's going to be used for performance evaluation? Let's talk about those things, not, you know, hide behind grade inflation, or which has been going on, right? As Natasha said, or academic integrity, which is an important thing unto itself.
I saw in the comments a question on ungrading, and I think since we're talking about grades and sort of how that fits, I'm happy to jump on that if there's still time for us to do so. So one of the things I'll say about ungrading is it's any kind of implementation of an innovative practice that we engage in higher ed. We need to make sure that our students are set up in that experience to meaningfully engage with it. So let me explain what I mean by that. Oftentimes, particularly when it comes to things like ungrading or other types of specs grading or whatever grading things might happen, it is one faculty member on one course who's like, guess what we're doing? We're doing something different. And it gets hit by students who have come from years of other types of schooling and grades and asking these kinds of questions. They're like, whoa, whoa, whoa. I don't know what to do with this. And everything else that I'm experiencing at this time that I'm spending, you know, I'm doing all these other grades and things. It creates a cognitive dissonance that makes it very hard to implement in meaningful ways where you actually get the benefits that you can get with an ungrading approach. Same thing with like portfolios. If you do a class and you're like, I'm doing portfolios, but your whole program's not doing portfolios, it's not meaningfully embedded throughout, the benefit of students having that reflective view of their learning, you don't see because it's just one pebble in a stream of these things that are like, what? This is now something I have to work around because everything else is some other way that I've gotten. So I would say ungrading can be incredibly beneficial. It can be very freeing for both faculty and for students. But if it want it to be that experience, it needs to be something that you're having a conversation with as a program and agreeing to do together and engage in that. So it's not students going, wait, what am okay, and not really understanding how to navigate in that space because you just have years and years of indoctrinated like grade approaches of how do I navigate successfully this environment that you're going against. So I love it. I think it's really important to have conversations. I think it's also beneficial to open a conversation with students on grades and how they feel about grades and what stress they have related to it. Where, as they look across the syllabus, are they concerned? And they're thinking like, oh, this isn't going to work. Or where do they have times in a semester where there's big pockets of heavy grading for them that are tempering how they're thinking about spending their time and their work, and get normalize those kinds of conversations and talk about how might we change it, what might it look different. It's actually about the learning that I'm interested in, or whatever you might want to do. But yes, ungrading can be very beneficial and very interesting and fun and helpful, but it needs to be implemented as a shared initiative to really get that experience and not cause potentially cognitive dissonance that's unproductive for students.
And I just wanted to chime in and add to that because that's my experience. We and a couple of addendums. I engaged in the skills-based grading, so it's a little bit like ungrading, but that was exactly what I had to navigate a lot. Is, you know, at our institutions, there's many instructors that aren't going to embrace it. I've got a cadre that does, but it takes a lot of supporting of students to understand, to your point, that cognitive dissonance that's coming from 13, 15, however many years of educational systems that are much different than what you're asking them to do. So if you do change those assessment practices, it does take a lot to support students in that process of molding it. But I also wanted to add what I found, just because I'm a huge advocate and I can't, you know, stop myself from talking about it, is that it enabled me to focus on exactly what we are talking about here, on the process of assessment versus the end grade. It became so much more about looking at the assessment and the results and the feedback and having that cycle and what the students would do with the feedback and refining and shifting away from, but what is my final grade? Did I give enough points to pass the class? And that's to me where the biggest dissonance came for students, is understanding that it's yes, it's about passing the class, but I'm focusing you back on what have you learned in the process. And if you learn what the class based on our student learning outcomes is saying you're going to learn, you're going to pass. So let's not worry about that right now. Let's worry about this cycle of assessment and feedback and you refining your skills. But it is a lot of back and forth conversations. And still, I would say half my class ends and just goes, phew, I passed. Like, oh, but you learned too. So anyway, I just wanted to add, based on my experience, that 100% everything you said is true. But I love it still. So
Yeah, and I think that gets to even the whole compliance thing, right? Is just as an institution may do assessment to check the box and say they've done it, was it meaningful to them? Same thing with students in grading, right? If they're so focused on the grade and they throttle their learning potential to pass, right? Or what do I need to do to keep that A? Well, the question instead should be, what are you best going to get out of this course? What are the skills you really need to refine, and how can we best take you to that level? And that's where I think ungrading can be freeing for that, because they're less concerned about a grade and they're more focused on the actual learning and skills. But as Natasha pointed out, that's a huge mindset shift, because you try and engage students in that conversation and they're going to be like, I don't know, just what do I need to do? What do I need to satisfy to get through this experience or make you happy? And so, yeah, we
And it
have
can
to
also,
gauge that readiness.
I was also going to say, there's also equity issues. While it can be beneficial to equity, it can also be a deterrent. And so in some regards, if I am based on grade-based scholarships, you just freaked me out. I am so terrified. Like I need to know exactly what I'm getting, how I'm going to be judged, because I cannot lose this. If I have financial aid requirements that go around that, like all of these things start to now become issues and barriers to get to the learning that weren't there for me before. So if I figured out how to navigate this system, so conversations about grades, great. And all of this really important conversations to have, but before you start doing some implementation wide scale or things, just be careful, be mindful, talk to your students.
Natalia? Yeah, just something just popped up, in my in my thinking and the rationale of assessments. Um, we live in this Carnegie education system, right? And as a new SLO coordinator, just trying to get a handle of many things, right? Just starting, or new faculty. How do we grasp the root of assessment from the beginning? Whether they're formative assessments, authentic assessments, direct assessments. How do I start on Monday? Starting Monday, what can I do as an SLO coordinator, new to the position or new to the faculty position? Where do I begin with all this information?
Joe, I don't know if you have different thoughts on this, but I'll go and then I apologize, but I have to jump. I think one is, do not feel that you have to learn all the lingo. There are a lot of terminologies in assessment. There's a lot of acronyms related to assessment. They are not needed to engage in meaningful conversations around student learning, right? So if you are like, I need to get a glossary, I need to do all these things, I need to like breathe in and out, relax, away from your computer, it's gonna be just fine. So the language and all of these things, not important. I hope one of the threads that you've heard throughout this is the importance of conversations and questions. What do we want to do? What are we trying to do? What do I need to do? And so if you sit down and think, where do I feel confident on Monday in what I need to be doing? Like I have some responsibilities as an SLO coordinator. Do I know what those are? Okay, great. How has that experience been? What am I getting up against? Where are people feeling in relation to this? How would I know? With whom would I talk? And let me figure out that kind of lay of the land. So I know what I'm stepping into, and I have an understanding of where people are in that. And I'm not like, oh my gosh, I just came from a Friday SLO talk and I'm so excited and we're going to do all these things. And everyone's like, I'm back over here, like, talk to me about grade inflation, like, so think, how are you going to figure out where people are? And what questions do you want to bring back to this community? So you are part of a group. One of the beautiful things about assessment is that we all love to talk about assessment. You're going to find a lot of people that don't want to talk about assessment with you, or like, why are you trying to talk to me? We would love to talk with you about all of this work. So do not on Monday feel alone. Feel empowered to be a part of a community that is willing and open to help you with a wide variety of resources and examples, but figure out, what do you want to do? What are you getting into? And what questions do you have about the directions you want to go? That would be my advice.
Joe,
Yeah,
do you have any?
yeah, I think similar building off of Natasha's just phrasing a little differently. I always say with assessment, best thing you can do is build relationships and know what the people you're working with care about and what they value, because that then gives you a window to contextualize assessment and how it can answer those questions or provide beneficial byproducts to those things, so that it's less about pushing assessment and more about showing how assessment work can benefit them, and the work they put into assessment can benefit their already existing agenda and values. Because when framed that way, it then there's less argument and more reason to embed it in the regular everyday and regular conversations, and even then have those connections around teaching and learning as well as other elements. So yeah, I think that what I would do is like have those level setting conversations with people to make sure they understand assessment and value, and understand why it's important and how it can be important for them. Because I think if they just see it as this thing they're asked to do, then yeah, it's hard to then implement some of these other steps.
Let's start with question number one. So the questions are arranged around the 6 steps for SLO assessment, and those are published on coach's website. I think Enrique and others posted the link to those in the chat. So if you haven't seen them, then I think that coaches can still put those things in there. This part of the conversation really is a conversation. I really am welcoming questions, and again, I'm backed up with other expertise from coaches who are present here. So we'll be happy to address any questions that you may have. As Enriquez mentioned, what matters to us is what in the world do we do on Monday morning, and there is just so many, as Natasha mentioned, misconceptions, misinterpretations, all kinds of vocabularies, all kinds of understandings as to what it means to assess student learning. It already starts, I think Natasha alluded to it in her conversation, with what it is that we are trying to teach. And as we talk about what it is that we are trying to teach and how to gather information about it, the follow-up question to this is, or at least it should be, what it is that we want our students to learn. And I think that that's the part that, again, with this grading discussion, the administrative demands, the faculty inertia and so forth, we have all those things working against us. So the question of what it is that we would like to students to learn needs to be elaborated on upon with a bit greater detail. What happens here is that student learning outcomes are statements of what it is that students will be able to do as a result of instruction. So those are often translated as skills, competencies in practical sense, and perhaps knowledge and understanding in some theoretical ways. So let's just say I have certain ideas in my head, but it's the skill and competency that allows me to project those ideas on others and understand what others are saying. So ultimately, as we assess student learning, we should be able to observe to the demonstration of what it is that students can actually do. And that's in the nutshell, the discussion about SLOs. If I were to address Enrique's crucial, truly important question, what do I do as a new coordinator? I think it would be that. answer the question to what it is that teachers are teaching and what it is that students are learning as a result. Let's take it from there. So question number one in the Guide to Student Learning Assessment is course content analysis. And what does that mean? That's the origin of SLOs. This is where SLOs, student learning outcomes, originate. These days, you can even probably do it with ChatGPT. If you were to analyze the content of the syllabus, course study, or whatever you happen to call that document, make sure that you translate or interpret statements of student learning that are included in those documents to actual actionable behavior or things that students can do. And I think that's probably the hardest part to start with, because as faculty, you can probably Google up those ideas quite readily. We are used to the idea of covering the content of the course or introducing students or guiding them. So those words, if you think about it, those verbs really tell us, indicate what it is that faculty are going to do. And the point of it here is that it's really what matters is what students get out of this. So we need to switch the discussion from what it is that faculty are doing to what it is that students are learning. So I have 3 questions here, starting with number 1. How comprehensively does the course outline of record or similar document reflect the essential concepts, skills, and competencies that students need to learn? I think that Joe actually addressed this. This is the sky is the limit, pretty much, and really the depth of it really depends on you as a faculty of record who is responsible for the given course, talking to others within your department, perhaps even outside of your department, or experts in the field, to figure out what it exactly is that you want your students to take away from the course. And if you ask your colleagues, if you again ask experts in the field, you are going to know. This is really not that hard to do. Again, just moving away from that perspective that I am faculty and I'm doing everything I can to make you understand, and you, my dear students, are just not understanding it. Let's move away from that discussion. Let's see what instructional techniques we can apply to make sure that students learn, meaning that they are able to demonstrate their skills and competencies on the topic in question. In what ways can we ensure that language used in describing language student learning outcomes is specific, clear, and accessible to all students, particularly from equity perspective? I already see. Yes, thank you, Amanda, for pointing out ChatGPT. I tell you, these days it's just amazing how artificial intelligence can help us answer this question. This is something that again, historically, as I've been talking to faculty about assessment of student learning for years, has always been this murky area of philosophy and practice. This is what I think. This is what you think. We ended up having 5, 6, 7 faculty members participating in the discussion, 12 different ideas about what to do with this. The Bloom's taxonomy is out there, is probably as specific as it can get. And elaboration on verbs, elaboration of naming conventions should not be really a problem. Again, it is a good practice. I cannot, I guess, overstate the importance of it. Talking to others, making sure that people around me, around my department, know what it is that my students are learning. Once you have that, you are going to find really a lot of ways to validate the way you think, the way you consider, the way what you understand what it means to teach and how students are learning. How can we break down the overarching learning outcome into smaller achievable objectives that guide students towards the attainment of skills and competencies? This is the discussion that we've had, at least at community colleges in California, for quite some time. What's the difference between objective and outcome? And if I'm looking at one, can I tell that this is an objective and this is an outcome? And in reality, you really can't tell. it really depends on the context of the course. It depends on what it is that you're teaching and what it is that students are learning. In some courses, certain ideas will be overarching outcomes, whereas in others, those outcomes will become objectives as smaller steps to get to the outcome. If you remember, gosh, I want to say 1990s, the concept of outcome-based education was popularized. And that's when the idea of task analysis and those, oh gosh, behaviorists from way back when, from Piaget, became popular, talking about the observable behavior. Skinner comes to mind and others. The idea is that in order for you to be a good tennis player, you need to know how to set your foot on the court, how to swing the tennis racket, how to return the ball. Those would be smaller objectives, right? But the outcome is that you are able to play tennis. The same thing could be translated into other disciplines quite readily. Again, ChatGPT to the rescue, or your faculty around you could probably help. And just so that you know, the idea of the tennis player is not mine. I heard it way back when in my graduate school from Professor Desberg at Dominguez Hills, California State University, Dominguez Hills. So I just wanted to give him credit for that. But this is an example that apparently kind of like stuck with me since my master's degree time, that really to be a good performer, a good actor, good artisan, good at anything, you do need to know the steps that lead you to a level of mastery that's expected by the peers. That's what we are after. So if you were to think of a philosopher or a geographer or a mathematician, well, please do name one who doesn't need to show you the specific skills and competencies that determine, that underline the field of their study, the field of their expertise. So starting with course content analysis is probably the very first important step towards the development of student learning outcomes statements. Those are the specific observable behaviors that will tell us what it is that students need to learn as a result of our instruction. Amanda, if I could please have slide number 2. And yes, I welcome all questions. Yes, not a problem at all. If you feel you would like to, yes, if you want to make a comment, ask a question, please don't hesitate. So this takes us to the next part. In the interest of time, maybe I'm not going to be showing you necessarily Bloom's taxonomy. I think we already know what that looks like. But the statement design, once we understand the course content and we know what it is that we want our students to learn, again, it takes a bit of a shift, of a mind shift. Instead of trying to cover certain concepts in the course, instead of trying to guide our students or introduce them or provide an overview, we should look at what it is that Bloom's taxonomy has to offer and translate what it is that we as faculty are doing into what it is that our students are going to learn. So Bloom's taxonomy is going to help us put the faculty actions into what's expected instead of in terms of students' observable behavior. How can Bloom's taxonomy or similar classification of verbs be utilized to clearly define and articulate student learning outcomes and objectives for our courses? I think that's the question that we've been asking and answering for quite some time. You know, Amanda, I think I will go ahead and show Bloom's taxonomy. If I could please share my screen for a second, because I think that's important. Let me see here. Thank you. Okay. Let's go. Is that it? Can you see my Bloom's
Yep.
picture? Okay, super. Thank you very much. So there we go. It is important to keep in mind the pyramid picture from the very beginning, the foundation of remembering of certain facts. And it's interesting again that this is something that we probably take for granted, that we somehow perceive a person who recalls facts and figures readily. We perceive them as intelligent. But when you think about it, in Bloom's taxonomy, the recollection of facts, memorization, the repetition is something that's at the very bottom. What I don't necessarily like too much about Bloom's taxonomy is the understanding part, because again, when you think about it, how am I going to assess? How am I going to observe your understanding, right? I mean, Guillermo is walking there. He's smiling at me all the time. I'm sure he's understanding everything that I'm saying, right? So the way this is going to be translated into observable behavior is going through classification, description, discussion, explanations, and so forth. And those things can be observed quite readily. Now, when it comes to assessment itself, well, that's the next part that needs to happen here. Classification, description, discussion. We can observe these things. If we can, then we can assess them. Application, analysis, evaluation are following steps. They are more cognitively demanding steps on the pyramid. And finally, at the end of it all, we have the creation or generation of new knowledge. And ultimately, isn't it something that we would like our students to achieve? Isn't it the tip of our activities in the classroom, to make sure that our students can take whatever it is that we've taught them, move it to the next level, use it for their benefit, use it for their advantage? Just like Joe was saying, I think he made a comment about responsible borrowing. Never occurred to me that could be a student learning outcome. But what do you know? As students navigate our system, they are expected to know what it is that they are going to be spending their money on. We never teach that at school. It could be, I suppose, it could be an administrative unit outcome, or admissions and records, and people who deal with financial aid could probably address that. But it's very interesting to realize that we think that we are giving students a piece of information and it's all crystal clear, that they will know what to do with it. But in reality, that the issue of financial aid, if I were to use this example alone, lends itself to really endless explanations and support and whole realm of what it means to deal with financial demands of education, and if not personal life. So thank you very much. I'm going to stop this. Amanda, if you could please go back to the next slide. Oh yeah, that's it. Thank you. Thank you, Enrique. All right, super. Thank you very much. That's it. Could we, I don't know if I addressed everything on slide 2. Let me see. Yeah, I think we can, thank you, sorry. How do we differentiate between outcomes and objectives in the design of our statements and ensure they are appropriately positioned within the course structure? I think I explained that with the tennis example. We can probably move on. In what ways can we ensure that our SLOs are described as behaviors? That would be Bloom's taxonomy. Thank you so much, Amanda. Could we move to slide 3, please? Or step 3. Alignment to program and institution student learning outcomes. Again, that's a question that comes up all the time. And I think that the context in which this question shows up mostly is that of assessment. If I am in the classroom assessing my students, and let's just say that I already agreed that I'm going to be paying attention to their behavior, I'm going to assess what it is that they can actually do as a result of my instruction. Then the question is, what do I do with program learning? What about institutional learning outcomes? See, some colleges, some institutions do offer exit surveys of sorts, for example, or there's a focus group or student discussion group where people sit around, and one of the questions is, well, how was your experience? What do you think you've learned? Did we meet your needs? And those are good discussions to have if you want to assess or gauge the climate on college. There's the student satisfaction survey and so forth. But in reality, when you think about it, what do these questions have to do with what it is that students learn? That's the question for us that needs to be answered. So when it comes to program learning outcomes and institutional learning outcomes, well, those are all statements, just like student learning outcomes at the course level, that need to be considered from the perspective of the classroom interaction. Student learning outcomes for the classroom will be specific for the course. Program learning outcomes specific for the program will also be taught and learned in the classroom. There is no one else outside of the classroom. There is no more faculty at the program level that will assess student learning once students leave the program upon completion of 2 or 3 courses in the program. The same thing can be said about institutional learning outcomes. When it comes to institutional learning outcomes, those are those bigger vision-like statements that reflect on what it is that students can do upon graduation from the institution. So, for example, students who are institutions are higher education institutions would be asking or would be concerned with what it is that students can do with technology, whether they are leaders, what about their public speaking skills, what about critical thinking, what about problem solving, and so forth. So again, those should be statements and behaviors, skills, competencies that students can demonstrate pretty much outside of the classroom. They could be demonstrating them in any other classroom, in any discipline. It's just that the assessment of those can only happen at the classroom level. There isn't just once students leave our classroom walls and they are asked to well, how was your experience, or what have you done in your class? That's not really a question about student learning. Those questions can only be asked and answered in the classrooms. In what ways and external guidelines and standards as those from professional associations and credit will be integrated into the development of PLOs? Again, that's a discussion at the program level, just like in development of institutional learning outcomes should be a discussion at the institutional level. So that's where the role of SLO coordinator comes in, to make sure that all those entities are engaged, that they are all involved in the development of specific program learning outcomes at the division level or at the department level, at the program level. And then ultimately, those statements needs to be developed at the institutional level. And that's where the discussions, perhaps with the college council, with the cabinet, with the president, with the vice presidents, need to be taking place in collaboration with academic senate and other faculty groups who are going to determine what it is that we would like to make sure that our students can do as a result of attaining their skills and competencies within our institution. Number 4, please.
So, Jarek, I have a question for number 3, step 3.
Sure, go ahead. Yes,
so,
yes, Benny.
So at our course, so we're going through the process of evaluating or revisiting the current institutional learning outcomes. And then since last semester, so every month we talk about it. And I think that get to a point when we bring it to a larger body, then the feedback will be like, okay, if we, like, it's almost like, I feel like it's a chicken or egg, right? If they say, okay, because we talk about the alignment of the student learning outcome to the institutional learning outcome. So if we change or if we add an institutional learning outcome, but we don't necessarily have the courses aligning to the institutional learning outcome, then there'll be no data. But again, if you do not have an institutional learning outcome, the new one, then you may have classes that could have been mapped to the institutional learning outcome. So there were people debating which one should go first. And as so in particular context, we're thinking about, okay, digital literacy, right? With the generative AI, I think as a institution, I think we have maybe a more visible statement about, with the use of AI, generative AI, or maybe a much better defined digital literacy. And then but not all the courses will be necessarily mapped to that institutional learning outcome, which I understand. But then the debate turned into which way should that be first?
Right. So, well, let's see. That's a good question. Let's see if I can how I can tackle this one. Student learning outcomes, program learning outcomes, and institutional learning outcomes should coexist in any given course, right? So again, if I teach English, astronomy, philosophy, I have certain ideas that I would like to expose my students to, and as a result of my teaching, I'm going to organize all those instructional activities that I have for them. Students are going to be able to do things that are important for my discipline. Okay. Now, when it comes to program level outcomes, since you mentioned data, once I have that information, once I know what those student learning outcomes are for at the course level, I can assess them, I can generate data. The same thing happens with the program learning outcomes. So program learning outcomes are those outcomes that the program is going to be interested in making sure that students attain, right? So you're going to have a meeting at the department level, and there is, let's say, 3 or 4 courses that constitute a certificate or are important for transfer and whatnot. So there's just all kinds of different configurations within the departments. There's lots of collaboration between different departments as well. That could be considered just as much. But program learning outcomes would be the ones that will, again, coexist in the same classroom. So if I were to use, and I think I have another slide on this, that's I put the guide to student learning assessment. Please take a look at the bottom of the page. There's the whole PDF file that explains it. At the course level, let's just say I am interested in making sure that my students, this is hypothetical English 101, my students can write using grammar, and they can create a 3-paragraph essay, and then they are going to reflect on their personal experience. That I can assess. Then when it comes to program, however, my program as English department would be interested in bigger things. So those things would be something like APA style, citing of resources, making sure that there is a flow of ideas, right? That the ideas are well articulated. There's some kind of an introduction, there's development, there is the final conclusion. That would be true for anything that we do when we write in our department, regardless of the course. As a matter of fact, that's probably true if students write essays in psychology, philosophy, and any other topic, any other study area. Finally, then we have the institutional learning outcomes, and those would be, and again, Benny, since you mentioned data, once I have those program learning outcomes developed, I can assess them and I can generate the data. Finally, when it comes to the institutional learning outcomes, as I mentioned earlier, we look at the vision, at the mission of the college or university, and we identify specific skills and competencies that our students need to take away upon graduation. And those would be those broader skills that, again, we somewhat take for granted: communication skills, digital literacy, problem solving, communication, public speaking, and so forth. You can probably tell that these are important for pretty much any discipline that's out there. So again, once we have those, we can assess them. And I will be talking about assessment in just a minute, how to put them all together. But just to give you a quick example, again, as an English instructor, if I were to ask students to stand in front of the classroom, very traditional way, that's my public speaking, by the way, right? And now go ahead and tell us about your life experience on the basis of the essay that you wrote, and give me a paper copy, and now you talk to everybody else about that. And that would be an assessment that will include all three: course, program, and institution at the same time. So for me, the question is not really which one is first, but how to make sure that they all coexist in the same course. I think that's the challenge. Thank you, Amanda. I know it's 10 minutes. Joe and Natasha just took all my time. So would you please go to number 4? Benny, are you okay with that? Or
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. So now when it comes to the direct assessment rubric design, again, on the coach's website, you can find Linda Saski's presentations. She's the renowned expert on rubric creation. But the issue here is that the rubric design is one thing. What guides us, however, is the direct assessment part, meaning that direct assessment is really a concept, an idea that we catch students in the act of doing something that we expect them to do. And that's probably something that again, as faculty, I think Joe alluded to this in his presentation, teachers teach the way they were taught, right? I've gone through so many years. We all have gone through so many years of elementary, high school, college, university, endless hours in classrooms. This is what other teachers did to us. What can we possibly think when we leave our institutions where we have studied? Where we have studied? What can we possibly think if not this is the way to do it, right? There is a book, chapter 7. The test is next week on Thursday. What's the next question? And unfortunately, that part is so very difficult to change because we think with best of intentions that we actually do assess students. Well, we do. We give them quizzes, we give them tests, we ask them to write essays. It's happening all the time. We do it every single day. We ask students, hey, how are you doing? Are you any questions about homework? Do you have any questions about what we just discussed? What do you think about X, Y, and Z, the concepts within the course? So all of these activities are taking place. It's just that they are not really focused on what it is that students learn, but rather, oh yes, this student is doing well on the quiz. They completed all the homeworks. Well, that's 75% of the grade. I'm going to give them 10 more percent because of the office hours, and then there is 10 more points for participation in the classroom. We are up at 95%. Yeah, that's it. That's your grade. See you later. Good riddance. I'm keeping my fingers crossed for you. And that's not really the direct assessment method. This is more of a method of making sure that students comply with the course requirement as outlined on the syllabus, for example, right? As expected of the faculty. But that's not always necessarily with the provision that students will have enough opportunity to demonstrate what they have learned. So direct assessment has to do with observable behavior or again, making sure that we have enough time and space to observe what it is that students learned as a result of instruction, and we documented it. Again, Benny, going back to your question, that's how we generate the data, right? We observe specific things, we put them in the rubric that translates to a number or a comment or some kind of a statement that is going to satisfy the level of mastery for the course. I think that's it. Amanda, if you could please move on to number 5. And that's, thank you, Benny. I think I explained that slide quite a bit actually by now. But how can we design assessment rubrics that accurately measure the skills and competency outlined in the student learning outcomes at the course level? By now it's just so very easy. Canvas, many of us use Canvas. If it's not mandated, then a lot of us use it anyway. Has this rubric feature there, and it really is not that hard. You can probably do it in one afternoon and outline the learning outcomes in syllabus by embedding them in specific slots to generate a rubric. If not, there's just so many different ways to generate rubrics. There's rubric creators online, completely free, and they are just very, very readily available. Just pick your favorite one and you're going to be the master of your own craft again on Monday morning, because it's just so ubiquitous and so easy to do these days. What ways can direct assessment activities such as presentations and portfolios be utilized to evaluate PLOs and ILOs alongside the course level outcomes? Again, Benny just stole my thunder. Thank you very much. That's exactly what it is. It's the direct assessment is what helps us observe student behavior. That's the idea that drives our assessment activities. As long as students are out there and they perform, we can observe, we can attest that they've learned things, we can document it, we can generate data. One interesting idea here is that rubrics are just those very powerful tools that specify the expectations for student behavior. And during the assessment process, it's just a fantastic idea. I saw it how it was demonstrated in one of the classrooms 3 years back, when the teacher actually passed around assessment rubrics to all students in the classroom, and students were supposed to evaluate their peers. And all of a sudden, it became such a great tool to assess not only what was happening in the classroom, but what it is that we could do to improve instruction, to improve student learning. When you think about it, students talking to their peers in for let's say you have a presentation for about 10-15 minutes, and students are standing in front of the classroom, and all students in the classroom have to listen to the same presentation from different people. In the long run, it may be somewhat boring, but students paying attention to the rubric and making sure that the student who is being assessed does things that they are expected, that's very, very, very revealing to many of them. And for the faculty, all of a sudden you realize in how many different ways this performance can be evaluated from how many different perspectives. See, every student brings something new to the table. They all talk about the same topic. They all exhibit similar behaviors. And all of a sudden you realize how different we really are. Yet it's all meeting the level of mastery. We are all learning in the process. And finally, Amanda, if I could please have step number 6. This is the closing of the assessment loop. As a result of the data, we can improve teaching, we can request resources, we can request money, we can ask for support, we can ask for help. That's ultimately the goal of assessment of student learning. Ultimately, we are here to serve our students. They are the ones who need to benefit from all these activities. So I think this is a lightning speed, just like Natasha started. That's how I'm going to end this.